Good evening and good morning, everyone. This is I am Ahmedabad's Chirantan Chatterjee, and we are talking today to reputed business management scholar, Professor R. Edward Freeman, who is a professor of business administration at the Darden School of the University of Virginia, and is especially known for his work on stakeholder theory and on business ethics. Welcome, Ed, to the podcast and to this discussion today with me.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
So, Ed, I want to chat a little bit about the larger impact about your research on responsible management and stakeholder theory, but also coming to what's happening with the pandemic, not just in richer economies like US, but even in poorer economies like India. I would love to start off there and say, what are your observations in terms of how, let's say, a stakeholder orientation can help us solve the frictions and the deepening of inequalities we are potentially seeing in society and in markets, and what your theory may have to inform us there from a business school perspective.
Well, one thing we know is that companies who take care of their stakeholders, who pay attention to employees, pay attention to customers and suppliers and communities, as well as the people with the money, actually do better. They perform better on a lot of dimensions. One of the reasons is, when push comes to shove, if I've been good to you and taken your interest into account, you're more likely to reciprocate with me. We see that with people accepting pay cuts and furloughs and this sort of thing all over the world, really. I think the problem is many business people don't believe that. They don't believe the research, or they think the research only applies to the relatively well-off economies in the West. But the truth is, I think it's pretty straightforward. If you try to make your customers' lives better, if you try to make your suppliers' lives better, if you try to make your employees and communities' lives better, you're simply going to be better prepared to withstand events like the pandemic. Now, that's not to say that everyone will make it through, because we've never seen a disruption quite like this, with some business models hit more, affected more than others. On the whole, I'm pretty optimistic that we've gone far enough down the road of adopting something like a stakeholder model for business, so that we'll make it through this pandemic. And when I say that, I'm not just talking about, again, the richer Western economies. I've spent some time in India and Indonesia and other places around the world. And I remember, especially in India, I had a number of conversations with CEOs of medium-sized companies. And they saw the stakeholder idea as second nature to them, because they understood it's the role of business to help build their communities. Of course, businesses have to make money, just like human beings have to make red blood cells. But the purpose of a business, for the most part, is not just to make as much money as you can. So I'm optimistic that we'll recover from this, that business can lead that recovery. It'll be different in different parts of the world, again, depending on what our governments do. But I think we'll come out of this with an even more committed, with even more of a commitment to thinking about business and the underlying narrative of business in stakeholder terms. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to follow up with some concrete examples, because there seems to be some resource constraints arising given the pandemic. And also there is a wave of nationalism that is sweeping countries. certain companies in certain countries are being preferred to design the new business models around different sectors. For example, who will hold the power around the 5G standards in India today is a matter of huge debate. And there's a lot of jostling here happening between, let's say, a Qualcomm from the US and the Reliance from India and a Huawei from China. So in
Right.
that behavioral mindset, what we are essentially seeing is somebody has to win the race. I don't see cooperative setting up of better technology enhancing standards that can actually help each of these companies, also the consumers. So while it may be true that it's second nature to Indian businessmen historically, I just feel that today, the way the world is shaping up, given the geopolitics as well, there could be some challenges and threats to stakeholder theory in this rising wave of nationalism and one-upmanship that is happening in the markets. Any reactions to that, Ed?
Yeah, look, I think you're right. Nationalism, this almost perverted version of nationalism, doesn't go very well with the idea that businesses can make people's lives better across boundaries. And so putting that sort of nationalism boundary on it, or putting a technological or a company boundary within that, makes it very difficult for companies to pay attention to stakeholders in the way that they need to. I'm very worried that governments will, I want to say, almost ruin what's gone on by itself, and that is business people understand that just worrying about the money and shareholder value doesn't really work anymore. I mean, maybe it never did, but it doesn't work anymore. And so trying to force companies to do that within some sort of nationalistic framework, etc., I think that is a danger. Uh, what we're seeing, one of the good parts of that is one of the things we're seeing. There's a group called Just Business. It's not for profit, done by a fairly famous U.S. investor and Goldman Sachs, and they took the idea that the Business Roundtable, 180 or so of the U.S. biggest companies, committed themselves to value creation for stakeholders, and they're holding their feet to the fire. They actually have a website that tells people what these companies are doing with respect to the COVID pandemic and stakeholder value. Which ones are sort of stepping up and really taking care of their employees as best they can? Which ones are what are they doing for customers and communities, etc. And if you look at that website, it's pretty exciting what companies are doing. There are issues. I think you mentioned the 5G thing as a good example. There are always issues where governments try and improve for whatever reason what private voluntary activity of business can do. And some businesses will try, I mean, it's the very definition of crony capitalism. Some businesses will try to, use government simply to their advantage and not to the advantage of their stakeholders. This ultimately, I think, doesn't work, but it only doesn't work to the extent that, we live in a relatively free society where if I don't like what happens enough, I'll figure out a way to do it better and go figure out a way to go around whatever the crony capitalist solution turns out to be.
So I just want to stay with this point one more time, Ed, if that's okay.
Sure.
Because I just feel, as a observer of what's happening here in India and also what's happening in the US, all stakeholders in the process, whether it's the employee, whether it's the external customer, or it's a regulator. Everybody seems to be quite vulnerable to the central actor here, which is the firm, in some sense, with the pandemic. And behind me is this picture that comes from Tom Piketty's work on how the division, what the gap was between the top 10% and middle 40% in India in 1951, and how that was in 2010. And 10 years down the line today, as we discuss this, I just wonder how more this gap would have been because of this, because of this pandemic and the potential crony capitalistic kind of role certain firms, anchor firms, are playing in the ecosystem, especially with stifling of choices and options. In that regard, I would love your thoughts on the role that startups and competition can play to offer some sort of a balancing that, let's say, dominant firm may play in the ecosystem, with whichever markets we are talking of. So it would be nice to say how your stakeholder theory then translates into some sort of a sustainability kind of a paradigm, a sustainable paradigm, when there is crony capitalist anchor firms, and then there is a gale of creative destruction by startups in the same market space potentially. Do you see that that is one way to sustain stakeholder theory in the face of a large external shock like the pandemic?
Well, I'm not sure I buy into the whole creative destruction narrative, but it is true that innovation and startups are a critical part of every country's economy. We've in the U.S. Seen the number of startups, etc. What you want to look at is the birth-death rate ratio. How many businesses are born versus how many go out of business. And you want that ratio to be greater than 1. Ours has dropped below 1, I believe. And I think that's a real danger. So what happens is, look, if let's say I'm not happy with the way that food is offered for sale in stores, then I start an organic grocery store. May take me a while to build it, but what will happen is if I build it and I'm successful, what happens is the other companies will have to adapt. They don't have to go out of business, but they have to adapt. I think watching companies like Walmart and every other grocery store adapt to organic has been, a real win for the healthy grocery stores like Whole Foods and others in the U.S. So it doesn't have to be creative destruction. Companies can exist over time, and they can have continuous creation. Okay. Rather than creative destruction. And we need more of that. We need more companies adapting, figuring out how to do it better. How do you do that? You get engaged with your stakeholders. You have to figure out what makes people's lives better, and how you do that without making trade-offs. I can always make trade-offs. I can always say, well, I'm not gonna put any money in new product development, or I'm not going to spend any capex on new equipment that I need, and I'm going to do that to prop up earnings. That's not a very robust way of thinking about your business, and sometimes this is driven by the 23-year-olds who don't have anything to lose. There were students of ours, or maybe not, and they're just out there crazed to be, to see their vision as part of the world. They're not out there trying to make as much money as they can. I always tell them, look, if what you want to do is start a business to make money, you ought to get a job, because it's a hell of a lot easier to make money with a job than it is with a new company. But it's that entrepreneurial drive that's important. One of the things that's always impressed me, the 6 or 8 times I've visited India is the incredible entrepreneurial spirit that's there. We need more of that in the U.S. Because ultimately the entrepreneurial spirit is more important. It drives a huge check on crony capitalism.
Yeah, amazingly
And
said.
that's what we must have. So I agree with you. I think that's probably the biggest answer to me of how you deal with crony capitalism. You get people out there starting businesses that can do it better.
Mm-hmm. And just I mean, from my own research, I have seen that when there is an entrepreneurial spirit, there seems to be also a boundary condition around the space within which somebody is able to successfully scale one's company. And when I say space, it could be like a product market, it could be a geographical market. The moment you are trying to take a more stakeholder oriented entrepreneurial spirit beyond that boundary of whatever space they have chosen, it seems like the business model starts showing frictions and scale starts to suffer. We see that in microfinance, we see that in trying to provide affordable healthcare. India has this very interesting eye hospitals in southern India,
Right.
but they have not been able to scale up even within India, forget beyond India. Any thoughts there? Like, is the size of the market a deterrent to
Well,
scaling stakeholder
yeah,
oriented?
I don't know if it's size of market. I do know sometimes when we try to scale, we're trying to scale around different sets of circumstances.
Right.
We see this especially in again in the U.S. is what I know best in education, where
Right.
someone will do an experiment and it'll work great, and then they'll try to scale it across the country and it fails miserably. So one of the reasons that entrepreneurship works is that entrepreneurs can have very detailed and on the ground knowledge of the situation, of the needs of particular stakeholders. And as sometimes we try to scale it, we try to generalize that, and it's just not there. Now, sometimes it works. Remember, our great companies, certainly the great high-tech companies in the U.S. and India as well, were once very small.
Yeah.
And they scaled because they figured out what was the right way to scale it. They figured out how to engage in the right way with customers and employees, etc. And so I think it's more the point you're making, which I agree with, is more a point about scaling a business
Mm-hmm.
than it is about anything else. Businesses are hard to scale when they depend a lot on the sort of existing local conditions. Some of them can't scale.
Right.
And sometimes people figure stuff out that just, let's do it like that, and then we could scale it. So I think it's a very tricky question that we don't pay enough attention to. It's not what are the conditions for scaling of any business. It's what are the conditions to scale this particular business.
And you have seen generations of potentially stakeholder oriented leaders, right, across the world. What's your observation on the role of the leadership fixed effect in driving the stakeholder orientation of companies? Is there, I mean, there is research in economics, for example, that show that CEOs who are born during depression in the long run have a different type of a risk propensity than other CEOs who are not born, let's say, during the Great Depression. Does it matter apart from the other conversations we are having here? Like Paul
Well,
Polman is a different character than other Unilever CEOs. Any thoughts?
well, let me ask you to remember that I'm not an economist; I'm a philosopher, and so I might have a different view about that. I'm also a little bit of a leadership skeptic. Jim Collins in Built to Last, I think it was, or Good to Great, Jim would say, in medieval times, people would say, why did my crop fail? God did it. Why did my child get sick? God did it. Why did it rain today? God did it, etc. And as the Renaissance happened, as we got more scientific, etc., not that you couldn't believe in God, it's just that we got better explanations for those things. And he says, well, management theory is a little bit like that. Why did this company fail? Leadership. Why did this company succeed? Leadership. Why was this project successful? Leadership. And he wants to be kind of a skeptic. He did find a couple of things in his work, which I think are interesting, that the leaders he was interested in were fiercely determined, and they were humble. In other words, there's something about, the way I would put it is, there's something in leaders that's about having a purpose. And you want to drive ahead on that purpose until you figure out that, hey, it's not going to work. And you got to have enough humility to understand that, it's not up to you. It's up to the people that you work with. You try to guide it, etc. Leadership that takes a stakeholder orientation. Again, it's been shown by a very famous study by Robert House and Mary Sully DeLucchi and others. It's been shown that those companies perform better. But it's about being in addition to being self-regarding, it's about being other-regarding as well. Maybe that's the key to those people born in the Depression. You grew up being other-regarding because you sort of had to. Hopefully, what the pandemic does, hopefully, is give us another big dose of being other-regarding. This assumption that human beings are kind of one-dimensional maximizers of their economic interest. I don't think that was ever a very interesting assumption. It's certainly not now. There are people who are one-dimensional maximizers of their short-term economic self-interest. We call them sociopaths. And in a way, we've kind of invented an economics for sociopaths. In the U.S., at least, we take those people and generally elect them to high office. Though I want to be clear, that's a nonpartisan statement coming from me. I don't know if you do the same in India or not. I gave up. I gave up trying to understand Indian politics a number of years ago, and now I just focus on the cricket, which I really like. It seemed easier for an American to understand cricket than it did the politics that were there, and I'm sure somewhere those are related.
That was a good detour. Ed, you have been so influential and active, productive. So many papers, books, new thoughts. The Academy of Management has rewarded you with lifetime awards, and generations of PhD students have come out working with you. I have not worked with you ever, but I have followed your work so closely that I felt tempted to reach out to you to ask for this session today. There would be some students with us in today's seminar, in today's conversation. I just want some thoughts from you on how you maintain the fire in the belly, the purpose in your work. And secondly, your tips and tricks on constantly being curious and asking iconoclastic questions. We're never accepting things as is. Like you said, it's not the leader, it's not God who made the rain. Something happened. There's a science behind stuff. So if you could share some thoughts, especially for, let's say, the PhD students or young assistant professors, even a lot of MBA students in India who potentially have an entrepreneurial spirit. and would love to hear from your long work how you maintain the fire in the belly and how you keep your curiosity and science alive, because the world is quite different today,
Yeah.
and there are lots of issues going on. Yeah. So your reactions to that?
Way back in the day, I'm going to tell you a story that's doesn't put me in such a good light, but I think it's the truth. Way back in the day, I was finishing my PhD in philosophy. I was in my early 20s. I had no idea what I was going to do, and I grew up kind of poor by U.S. standards on a dirt farm, and I didn't know anything about business. And I asked a guy on my dissertation committee asked me what was I going to do next year. Now, there were no jobs in philosophy ever, and there certainly were none in like 1975, whenever that was. And he said, "Well, you should do a postdoc." And I went, "Great, I knew that paid, and I had every crap job to put myself through college and grad school that I could, so I wasn't afraid to work." He said, you're interested in ethics and decision making and stuff, and you should go to Wharton. I know some people there. And honest to God, I said to him, I said, "What's Wharton?" I mean, I'd never heard of it, And he said it was a business school. And I went, I don't know. And then I said, "Is it a good one?" And he said, "Well, it's one of the best." And I said, "But it's a business school." He goes, "Yeah." And then I say, "Well, where is it?" Because I literally didn't know. I mean, I didn't know what I didn't know. And he said, "Well, it's in Philadelphia, University of Pennsylvania." And I said, "Well, I might be interested," because my girlfriend at the time was going to go to Penn in Philadelphia in city planning. And so I show up at Wharton, get interviewed, get hired in a sort of postdoc thing. And a few months into that, the guy I worked with said, "Why don't you see what you can make of this stakeholder idea?" It was sort of there. It's been around. No one knew what the origin was, so I could track that down and then take it from an idea that was primarily about organizing information to do strategic planning. In those days, you did environmental scanning, and it was just to figure out the trends. To a way to think about, gee, if I took the stakeholder idea seriously, how would I actually run this company? And so I started working on that, and the more I worked on it, got to work with a bunch of companies there at it was called the Wharton Applied Research Center, the more interested I got in it. The girlfriend thing worked out. We've been married for 43 years, so that part worked out well. But it was really, being in there's a lot of serendipity in this. A lot of just, you were there, something happened, and you knew this was something you needed to try to take advantage of, to try and push. And so it wasn't, I see too many young faculty now spend all their time worried about how do I get a paper in this journal or that journal. And my advice to them is always, find something you've got to know the answer to. You got to figure this. I mean, I had to figure out this business thing because I didn't know anything about it. And if that was going to be, if I saw myself as teaching in business schools, I needed to figure out what the hell business was about. And I was ignorant enough, not trained in business at all. I was ignorant enough not to know that this wasn't common sense. I mean, I always thought the stakeholder idea was the most common sense idea in the world. I mean, what does a business do? It creates products and services for customers, jobs for employees, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so when I wrote that old book that gets so many citations now, Strategic Management and Stakeholder Approach, I didn't think the stakeholder idea was even the most interesting idea in the book. And so I mean, most people thought there were no interesting ideas in the book, so that was a different thing. But it's that being open to serendipity, being open to what musicians would call improvisation, and sort of seeing your career a little bit. I would say now, though I didn't at the time, seeing it much in the way an artist sees a canvas. It's yours to fill. It's yours to figure out, and you may as well figure out how to do something that you got passion for. And so I've always been just incredibly lucky about that stuff, and I've always gotten way too much credit for it. I didn't invent this idea. I made maybe one small contribution to it. I happen to have written a book that's cited easily, and so I think it has something like 40,000 citations now. Somebody asked me recently, what's it like to write a bestseller? And I went, I don't know. They only printed 2,000 copies of this book. So, I can't, and you can't take it too seriously, in that sense. There have been a lot of people who've worked on the stakeholder theory idea, and that's been good. I feel really good to have been a part of that, etc. But I think it's more having some passion for something, and following that passion. I've often said, look, I'm a total one-trick pony. It's a pretty good trick, but nonetheless, I'm pretty much a one-trick pony. I've been trying to get people to understand we need a narrative of business about stakeholders. And I've written that in a lot of different ways, and I think finally, not due to what I've done, but what I and a lot of other people have done, that message is starting to come through. There's no going back to the old days of business is only about the money and only shareholders count. It'll take another generation or so to change completely. But I think we're past the tipping point of that.
Excellent. I know that you have to go for another meeting. Maybe it's time to wrap up. And you talked about three key things. One is you are a philosophy PhD student who now is a very well-respected business school professor. Your idea around the stakeholder theory and the future of business, since we are now in the middle of this quite a cataclysmic pandemic that is affecting our lives globally. How do you see the future, Ed? Where are we heading towards? If you have some.
Yes. Well, I'm kind of one of those wildly optimistic people who, again, I think with the caveats you said about nationalism and crony capitalism, which can undo it. One of the things we're seeing is massive calls for the reform of capitalism along a lot of different ways. I was at a meeting at the White House in the last days of the Obama administration, and had everybody from all these groups, from conscious capitalism, from inclusive capitalism, from impact investing, just capital, et cetera, talking about what's the right brand, what's the new capitalism going to look like, what's the brand. And of course, everybody thought their version was going to be the right brand. I began to think that it's kind of the wrong question. Given that all this critique is there, what we ought to ask is, what are the 4 or 5 key ideas that any new version of this has to deal with? And so 2 colleagues, Bethan Parmar and Kirsten Martin and I wrote a book called The Power of And, Responsible Business Without Trade-Offs, which just came out. And in that we said, look, regardless of the brand, what's got to happen is it's got to be purpose and profits, stakeholders and shareholders. We got to see business as a societal institution as well as an economic institution. We got to see people as fully human as well as economic beings, and we got to put ethics and business together. And what we try to do in the book is give lots of examples of companies that do that. At the same time, we made a documentary, and the documentary produced by Bobby Parmar and Jenny Meads called Fishing with Dynamite. And it's about how the stakeholder idea emerged, and it's juxtaposed with the shareholder primacy idea. We did those things because we wanted to communicate with the book to business people, with the film to lots of people, to say, hey, you know, business can be about making society better.
Right.
And that's really what we have to do. We have to see business as how do we make society better. You know, as and most entrepreneurs, that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to figure out some way to make society better, or make a business better able to satisfy their stakeholders. So I'm pretty optimistic that this is going on. It's going on all over the world. I mean, if you look at the different views from social entrepreneurship to regular entrepreneurship to all these movements, it's pretty impressive. And the external stuff, the global financial crisis, which we still haven't completely recovered from, global warming as an issue, and now the pandemic, I think are clear external issues that say we will not work our way out of these with doing more of the wrong things, with doing just more of it's only the money, it's only shareholders. So I think there's a moment here for us to really embrace these relatively new ideas. And it looks like a lot of folks are doing that. And that's one of the reasons I'm so optimistic. Though it's generational to make changes like this. If you think about how long we've been trying to make the change that, let's say, men and women are morally equal, we've gotten better at it, but it's taken a long time, and there's a lot more to do. So my hope is that if I were to have grandchildren or their children, they would say something like, what's up with way back in the day when people thought business was just about the money? Well, what were you guys smoking that got that so wrong?
That's amazing, Ed. Thank you. Thank you so much to end on that, and wish you safe health, stay safe and take care. Hopefully we can also host you in India in campus in your next visit as things clear up a bit. Thank you very much, and wish you also a productive rest of the year.
Thanks very much, Chirantan, and the same to you and your colleagues there. It's been a real pleasure.